Anasintaxi on the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. Anasintaxi on the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union Part 1. The working class in the Khrushchev-Brezhnev period was no longer the owner of the means of production. Hosted on Espresso Stalinist. The working class in the Khrushchev-Brezhnev period was no longer the owner of the means of production. Socialist production relations were replaced with capitalist production relations. It is known that no matter what the economic forms of production are, the workers and the means of production remain always its factors, and that for production to take place they must unite. K. Marx. The essence of this relation in the production process, that is, the essence of the production relations, is determined by the ownership relations. The form of ownership is the essential and the main feature of the production relations. Which social class has the ownership of the means of production, and how the union of the producers with the means of production is realized, and this is precisely what distinguishes the different epochs of social organization. The particular way that this union is realized distinguishes the different economic epochs of social structure. K. Marx. Slave owning, feudal, capitalist and socialist communist system. Ownership is here a historical economic, not a legal, category. After the victorious October armed uprising, and the complete smashing of the bourgeois state machinery, the working class of Russia took the political power, established the dictatorship of the proletariat, and, over the next years, proceeded gradually to all the necessary revolutionary changes in the sphere of economy, the socialization of all means of production, abolishing the capitalist relations of production and thus making the new socialist communist relations of production. Upon the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the working class became the dominant class in the socialist Soviet Union, not only politically but also economically. It became the owner of the means of production. As a social class, it possessed and controlled the means of production through the dictatorship of the proletariat guided by the Communist Party. The dictatorship of the proletariat is complete only if it is led by one party, the Communist Party, which does not and cannot share power with other parties. Stalin. In this way, the separation of the direct producers, i.e. of the working class, from the means of production was terminated, a characteristic feature of the capitalist mode of production and the proletariat, and the historically last form of exploitation, the capitalist, was eliminated. The abolition of the capitalist ownership, private state, in the means of production eliminated the antagonistic contradiction between production forces and production relations. In contrast, the overthrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat after the death assassination of Joseph Stalin, March 1953, and its replacement with the dictatorship of the emerging bourgeois class not only resulted in the loss of power from the working class, it was not anymore the dominant class in the Khrushchev-Brezhnev period, but also in the loss of control over the means of production. The working class was not anymore the owner of the means of production which hitherto controlled and possessed as a class through the dictatorship of the proletariat. A few years later, in the 22nd Congress of CPSU, 1961, even the Soviet revisionists themselves admitted that there was neither a state of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet Union after 1953 nor a communist party, and that these had been replaced by, respectively, the all-people's state, that is, the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie, and the all-people's party, that is, a bourgeois social democratic type of party. The fact that the working class in the Soviet Union of the Khrushchev-Brezhnev period had lost its historical mission as a leading social force, and that, moreover, had been permanently removed from the management of the economy, and, therefore, was not any more the owner of the means of production, is reflected in the following. First, in the overthrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat, through which the working class owned the means of production, and its replacement with the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie, that is, from the change of the state's class character, transformed from a state of the dictatorship of the proletariat to all people's state, i.e. the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie. Second, in the change of its party's class character, from a revolutionary communist party, that expressed, defended its interests and led the dictatorship of the proletariat, it became an all-people's party, that is, a bourgeois social democratic type of party, which no longer was guided by the worldview of the proletariat, the revolutionary Marxism, i.e. Leninism, Stalinism, but by the bourgeois ideological political current of the Khrushchevian revisionism. This party was on the forefront of the capitalist reforms that eliminated socialism, communism, and brought about the restoration of the capitalist production relations. Third, in the loss of control over the means of production that obviously deprived the working class of the capacity to have a say in the state and in the economy, that is, in the control and management of the production. Fourth, in the industrial units where, according to the 1965 reforms, only the manager decided what would be produced, determined the wages and, in addition, how many workers would be hired and how many would be fired, leaving the working class as simple production force, like in the traditional capitalism of the Western countries. Fifth, in the appropriation and distribution of the social product which the working class also did not influence in the least. In the process of capitalist restoration, the overthrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat and its replacement with the all-people's state was unavoidably accompanied with the elimination of the socialist-communist production relations and their replacement with capitalist ones. The change in the class character of the state was the cause of the complete change in the content of the property relations, the most important element of the production relations, that is to say, the transformation of socialist to capitalist ownership that preceded the change of the other elements of the production relations like the distribution, the exchange relations etc., which were also converted from socialist-communist to capitalist relations. It could not happen otherwise, since the character and the content of ownership is dependent on and determined by the state's character, in this case by the all-people's state. Of course, the state property in the economy of the Soviet Union, for a number of reasons that are beyond the scope of the article, was not divided in smaller parts but it retained its form. However, the content of this property had radically changed. It had lost the socialist-communist character and it was transformed to state capitalist property. 1. The capitalist character of the state enterprises and cooperatives. 1.1 State enterprises. During the Leninist-Stalinist period, 1917 to 1953, especially after the construction of the economic foundation of the socialist-communist society, the state property constituted of the two forms of socialist-communist property, state and collective/cooperative. It was the dominant and the most advanced form of property in the socialist economy of the Soviet Union, to the level of which the collective, cooperative property was developing, so that they will be finally merged in the unified communist property through the tractor stations. The latter were abolished by the bourgeois Social Democratic CPSU in 1958, and as a consequence not only the merging of these two forms of property was cancelled but their content was radically altered. The state enterprises were socialist because they constituted collective social property of the working class that controlled and managed through the dictatorship of the proletariat under the guidance of the Communist Party. It was the presence of the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat which determined the socialist character of the state enterprises because, as it is known, state property is not by itself socialist, due to belonging to the state, but because it is in the hands of the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat, thus, in the hands of the working class. Precisely for this reason, the state property in socialism-communism has a completely opposite social content and orientation than state property in the capitalist and revisionist countries, being in the hands of the exploiting bourgeoisie. It is obvious that the bourgeois nationalization has nothing in common with the socialist nationalization of the means of production carried out by the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat and results in the abolition of capitalist exploitation. For as long as the capitalists remain the ruling class, state property is a form of capitalist property, a state monopoly property, in which exploitation of workers prevails. As long as the proprietor classes stay in power, nationalization does not amount to elimination of exploitation but only to the change of its form. Father Engels, because the bourgeois state is still the state of the capitalists, the defender of capitalist exploitative system. The course of Soviet Union in the path of socialism-communism was halted when the dictatorship of the proletariat was overthrown and replaced by the bourgeois all-people's state, resulting in the loss of the control property of the state enterprises from the working class. The change of the state's class character radically altered the content of the enterprises in the economy of the Soviet Union. From socialist they were transformed to capitalist enterprises, since it is the state's character that determines the character of state enterprises, in this case the bourgeois all-people's state, that is, the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie. The anti-Marxist claim made by the Khrushchevian revisionists, that socialism was allegedly preserved in the Soviet Union after 1953 due to presence of state enterprises, does not have any basis, because it was precisely the new state, i.e. the bourgeois all-people's state, that determined the capitalist character of the state enterprises during the period. If one accepts this false and totally baseless claim, then one is obliged to regard as socialist state enterprises of the Western capitalist countries, or to regard as socialist even the Bismarckian kind nationalizations, or to call socialist the institutions like the Royal Maritime Company or the Royal Porcelain Manufacture. Father Engels, Anti-During, 1877. Besides the fact that the character of the state enterprises is primarily determined by the character of the political power, that is, by which class has the political power in the corresponding class state, the capitalist character of the state enterprises is also reflected in how they function and the purpose of the production. The state enterprises of the Khrushchevian period were fully autonomous commodity producers that worked on the basis of complete economic self-sufficiency, equals Chazraskot equals Wirtschaftsführung, guided by private financial criteria, profit efficiency, and had profits as their exclusive purpose. More accurately, the purpose of the state enterprises was the maximization of profit, like in the traditional capitalism of the Western countries, and not, anymore, the satisfaction of society's ever-increasing needs. The profit maximization, pursued through the price increases, was admitted by the Soviet revisionists themselves. There are enterprises the directors of which do not see only the reduction of expenses as the source of profit but also the illegal determination of prices. The directors of enterprises who set higher prices in their own orders, place their own private business interests above those of the whole society and, in this way, they cause damage to the state. Soviet Science, 8 1969. So, after the launch of the capitalist reforms, the large enterprises of various branches in the economy of the Soviet Union and the other revisionist countries that could increase their profit not through the increase of production and the decrease of expenses but through the increase of prices and the example of the capitalist monopolies, Lang, ended up to that point correctly predicted, already from 1957, by the world-famous Polish revisionist economist Oskar Lang. In the case of the larger enterprises, it is feared that they will come to an agreement among themselves and set high prices. If this happens, then the enterprise will lose its socialist character and we will have a syndicated monopoly. Every enterprise, or group of enterprises, in an agreement among themselves, would be de facto owners of the means of production and not managers of the total social product and would pursue to extract the maximum profits through the determination of prices favorable to them. In this case, production would not serve the best possible fulfillment of the whole society and the driving force of production would be the pursuit of profit, be these individual enterprises, of their staff or the united enterprises, and this would have nothing in common with socialism. Lang, our underlining. This development was observed, and openly confirmed and admitted after published articles in the revisionist press. Our experience shows a dangerous trend for arbitrary determination of prices. Voprzy Ekonomiki, 6 1970. The producer dictates the prices, and often maintains shortages of special goods to increase pressure on the consumer. Ekonomicki Jnauki, 11 1971. Besides, one of basic goals of the capitalist reform of 1965 was, among other things, the establishment in various branches of the economy of the Soviet Union of large monopolistic enterprises and complexes, monopolistic unions that took the form of combines, trusts and cartels, or as it was often mentioned, one combine, one trust in Verordnung über den sozialistischen staatlichen Produktionsbetrieb, October 4, 1965. And permanently repeated later in various other publications. Organizacja Uprawnija Promyślenia Gdziedzicznych, p. 16, Kiev 1980, etc. 1.2 Cooperatives. The cooperative and collective farm property was the second and less advanced form of the socialist-communist economy of the Soviet Union at its socialist stage in the Leninist-Stalinist period, 1917 to 1953. Cooperatives in socialism is not of course a new phenomenon since they also exist in capitalism where they have, however, a completely different character. They represent a capitalist form of economy, because the means of production belong to the capitalists who control the economy and exploit the farmers while, at the same time, constitute the politically dominant class organized in the bourgeois state. In the capitalist state, cooperatives are no doubt collective capitalist institutions. Lenin, On Cooperation, 1923. What determined the socialist character of the cooperatives in the Soviet Union of Lenin-Stalin was the working class rule, i.e. the presence of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the state of which owned the basic means of production. In connection to this, Lenin pointed out, the system of civilized cooperators, given social ownership of the means of production, given the class victory of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, the system of civilized cooperators is precisely the system of socialism. Lenin, On Cooperation, 1923. Under our system, cooperative enterprises differ from the private capitalist enterprises because they are collective enterprises, but do not differ from socialist enterprises if the land on which they are situated and means of production belong to the state, i.e., the working class. Lenin, On Cooperation, 1923. Therefore, the element that determines the character, capitalist or socialist, of a cooperative property is the class nature of the state. Following the prevalence of the Khrushchevian revisionist counter-revolution, the overthrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat and its replacement with the all-people's state in the Soviet Union, the working class and the peasants lost their power, while at the same time the character of the cooperatives changed. From a socialist form of property, cooperative property became a capitalist one. The cooperatives were converted to a capitalist form of economy and operated, too, as individual autonomous commodity producers, as the state enterprises, on the basis of complete economic self-sufficiency and guided by the private financial criteria of profit efficiency. Besides the presence of state and cooperative capitalist property in the economy of the Soviet Union, the capitalist reforms paved the path to the development of a private capitalist sector in agriculture, small industry, services, in different professions, etc. Next to the state cooperative sector, the emerging private sector became an important part of the economy thanks to the financial support from the state. laws, credits, etc. The development of the private sector was such that the small capitalist property was formally recognized in various articles of the new Brezhnev Constitution, 1977. This capitalist property took much larger dimensions since small production engenders capitalism and the bourgeoisie continuously, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 25, pp. 173 and 189. The private capitalist sector under the form of auxiliary household of the collective farmers and workers and employees, terms that the Khrushchevi and Brezhnevites used to conceal the private capitalist businesses in agriculture, in small industry and elsewhere, was under constant expansion and development, achieving an increasingly bigger contribution in the production of agricultural goods. According to 1970 data, 38% of all vegetables, 35% of meat and 53% of eggs were produced in the auxiliary households of the Soviet Union. Political Economy, v. 5, p. 310, Athens 1980. According to Liternaturная Gazeta, November 5, 1977, the private capitalist sector includes 3.6 million hectares of arable land which produce 31% of dairy products, 59% of potatoes etc. Towards the middle 1970s, the arable land increased to 7.5 million hectares yielding the 64% of potatoes, 42% of meat, 40% of milk, 65% of eggs, 20% of wool and of the total production. What must be noted is the constant increase of the volume of production coming from the private capitalist sector at the expense of the production coming from the cooperatives. In the 1977 Constitution, the Constitution of the Capitalist Restoration, despite the abundant socialist demagoguery, it was openly formulated and, for the first time, legally established that the Soviet state of that period was not the dictatorship of the proletariat but the bourgeois all-people's state, i.e. the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie. In addition, all the capitalist reforms were legally ascertained including, Article 16, the capitalist principles of economic autonomy and initiative of the enterprises, p. 47, of the economic self-sufficiency, p. 48, the profit, cost and other economic levers and incentives, p. 48. Apart from the establishment of state and cooperative property as forms of capitalist property in various articles of the new bourgeois constitution, the right to forms of private capitalist property was also established, Articles 13 and 17, using phrases such as supplementary part of land, parts of land provided the state and the collective farms according to the law on the supplementary household for tree and vegetable growing, p. 46, private labor in the sphere of small industry, agriculture, services, and other forms of labor activity, p. 48, which doesn't include only small pieces of land but it constitutes a large private sector of the economy. The restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union, 1953 to 1990. The working class in the Khrushchev-Brezhnev period was no longer the owner of the means of production. Part 2. B. In the commodity economy of the Soviet Union, labor power had been anew converted to commodity. The economic category labor power is the fundamental and most central for understanding scientifically the nature of the two diametrically opposite social economic systems of the 20th century, capitalism imperialism and socialism communism. It is this historical economic category that is related to both systems, with the existence of exploitation in capitalism and with its abolition in socialism communism, while its different character determines their essence respectively. As capitalism emerged, developed and dominated society as a full-fledged mode of production, the conversion of labor power to commodity was of decisive importance in the transformation of commodity production to a capitalist form, and it was one of the two fundamental features of the capitalist mode of production. On the contrary, in the case of socialism labor power loses its commodity character. It is not anymore a commodity. The production relations in the economy of the Soviet Union during the 1917 to 1953 period, i.e. the period of socialism communism, and later during the Khrushchev and Brezhnevite period, i.e. the period when commodity production dominated, were determined, in both cases, by the relation of the producers to the means of production or as Marx pointed out, it is always the direct relation between the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers in which the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure and, consequently, of the political form of the sovereignty and dependence relationship and, hence, of every special state form is found. K. Marx, The Capital, Volume 3. While in the first period, 1917 to 1953, i.e. the period of socialism communism, this ultimate secret was found in the workers' collective ownership of the means of production, i.e. in the ownership of the direct producers. The second period was characterized by the total separation of the direct producers, the workers, from the means of production, the result from the overthrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat and its replacement by the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie and the associated loss of political power, and the establishment of a completely new reality in the economy of the Soviet Union, new dominant relations of production. It was this economic reality that Marx named as specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor, our italics, is pumped out of the direct producers. K. Marx, The Capital, Volume 3. Upon the loss of the political power and the control of the means of production from the working class, the new state of things in the economy of the Soviet Union was characterized by a. The transformation of the working class to proletariat. B. The conversion of the labor power to commodity. C. The reappearance of exploitation. Deprived of the means of production, the working class of the Soviet Union was just a productive force, just like the proletariat in the Western capitalist countries. The means of production passed to the hands of the now dominant new bourgeoisie that owned and managed them according to its interests and, as an exploiting class, was appropriating the unpaid surplus labor extracted from the direct producers. To survive and make ends meet, the proletariat of the Soviet Union was compelled to sell its labor power to the new exploiting class, and more precisely, to the collective capitalist, the bourgeois all-people's state, the representative and defender of the interests of the new bourgeoisie. Thus, in the commodity economy of the Soviet Union during the Khrushchevian Brezhnevite period, labor power became once more a commodity, and the phenomenon of capitalist exploitation, characteristic in the Western capitalist countries, appeared again. Since then and in the coming decades, the same thing that happened in the Western capitalist countries took place in the economy of the Soviet Union, namely what Marx had seen in the capitalist system. Through its own function, the capitalist production process reproduces the separation of the labor power from the labor conditions. In this way, it reproduces and perpetuates the worker's exploitation conditions. It constantly forces the worker to sell his labor power in order to survive, and it constantly offers the capitalist the possibility to purchase it and enrich himself. K. Marx, the capitalist production process seen in its structure or as a reproduction process, produces and reproduces the very capital, on one side, the capitalist, on the other the waged worker. In the case of the Soviet Union, it is not about the private capitalist but the collective capitalist, the bourgeois all-people's state. Now, the claim of the Khrushchevian Brezhnevite revisionists that the labor power in the historical period, following 1953, was not a commodity. I.Kuzmino 1971, I.N. Shitao 1974, W. Batiru 1974, et al., because the working people, allegedly, continued to be the owners of the conditions and the result of the production doesn't have any basis whatsoever. It turns out to be a conscious political fraud, since this claim presupposes the presence of proletarian dictatorship through which the working people control both the conditions and the result of the production. However, the dictatorship of the proletariat did not exist then because it had already been overthrown 2 decades earlier, from the beginning of the 1950s, after the death assassination of Joseph Stalin. Of course, there were revisionist economists who openly admitted that the labor power had been converted to commodity in the Soviet economy after 1953, like W. Kornienko I. Pakamau, 1966, Ch. M. Miftakow, 1968, P. N. Rekowicz, 1968, Alan Beta Ustilo, 1966, while others were discussing about the value of the labor power. The objective basis to determine a minimum real income of the working people in the socialist production is the value of the labor power. Ch. M. Miftakow, 1968, i.e. as, in capitalism where the worker is paid according to the value of his labor power, or that in socialism the worker has the right to freely dispose his labor power. A. Sukho, 1972, like in capitalism of the Western countries. Moreover, other economists pointed out the resemblance of the wages in the Khrushchevian Brezhnevite socialism to the wages in capitalism. In socialist society, labor is paid in a form that is identical to the form of labor's price when we consider wages in capitalism. A. Aganbjan, W. Meyer, 1966. This resemblance necessarily leads to the admission that the labor power in the Soviet Union's commodity economy was itself a commodity. Others like E. L. Manwich, M. W. Kolgano, S. P. Figaro, observed in the sphere of circulation the presence of laws such as the remuneration of the time of labor power, and the value equivalence or equivalent of circulation. They referred even to an existence minimum, i.e., the survival minimum. In conclusion, both groups of economists recognized and accepted the commercial character of the labor power in the Soviet Union's commodity economy during the period following 1953. The above-mentioned facts, including the revisionist economists' open admission, show that the labor power had been anew converted to commodity in the Soviet economy of the Khrushchevian Brezhnevite period, and as a result capitalist exploitation had been restored. Analyzing the question of capitalist exploitation, capitalist appropriation in a commodity economy, such as the capitalist, Marx pointed out, to the degree that the commodity production evolves, according to its own inherent laws, to capitalist production, to the same degree the property laws of the commodity production are transformed to laws of capitalist appropriation. K. Marx. The replacement of the socialist-communist property relations to capitalist ones was accompanied by the same inevitable change in the socialist-communist distribution relations. The distribution relations are essentially identical to the production relations, their inverted side, so that both together have the same, historically transient character. K. Marx. The defined distribution is only an expression of the historically definite production relations. K. Marx. This means that the proletariat was paid on the basis of the value of the labor power while the exploiting new bourgeoisie was appropriating the surplus value generated by the workers in the sphere of production. Collectively as class, the new bourgeoisie made sure that a part of this surplus value was converted to capital and the rest was shared among its members in the form of very high salaries premiums. The restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union was also evident in the sphere of circulation relations, which are determined by the property relations, especially in the relation between enormously high salaries of the members of the new bourgeoisie and the salaries of the workers, and in their diametrically opposite interests. The latter formed the basis of the antagonistic contradictions of the Soviet society at that time. Engels had previously pointed out their importance. The economic relations of each given society are manifested primarily as interests. F. Engels. At the end of 1970s, the salaries and the premiums that the business and other executives received were 15 to 20 times higher than the workers' salaries. The situation was the same in the collective farms where the difference in salaries was as high as 1 to 30. According to the revisionist press, the largest part of the premiums, and in particular 82%, went to the pockets of the firm's directors whereas the remaining 18% went to the workers despite the fact that they constituted the overwhelming majority. 80 to 90% of the working people in the firms. Tirana radio station, April 2, 1978, and this gap was constantly growing at the expense of the workers.